I've called this video The Last Apache Wars, and if you've been following the playlist from the very beginning, which this is actually designed as a college course, then that will make sense to you because you will have been following the story for, I don't know, 45 hours or so. If you're picking up fresh, let me just explain what I mean by last Apache Wars. We're picking up where the conflicts that we discussed way back in lecture video number 40 about Apaches and Navajos during the Civil War. We're picking up where that left off. So we're picking up around 1872-73, generally speaking. And we'll be following the subsequent events from there. Now, I guess the earlier Apache wars in this context would have been the wars, the Chiricahua Wars, the wars led primarily by Mangas Colbaradas and the Cochise from 1861 to about 1872-73. Of course, there were centuries of Apache warfare against the Spanish, and there were things that happened obviously before 1861. But that's kind of the context of this particular narrative. Now, when most people think about the late 19th century Apache wars, particularly after Cochise, they think about this guy, Geronimo. And we are definitely going to be talking quite a bit about him. We've talked about him already in that earlier lecture video because he was involved in those wars in the 1860s and was a frequent ally of Cochise. But we're going to be looking at not only Geronimo and not only Chiricahua Apaches, but other Apache groups during the time period. Let's start by looking at a couple of maps that, again, if you've been following along from the beginning, you've seen before. Let's look at this one first that shows Apacheria, the Apache homeland as of the 19th century. So you can see the different groups here. You see there way over to the east along the Rio Grande, the Lipan Apaches in Texas, over there in the northeast in Oklahoma, the uh, Prairie Apaches, or sometimes they're called the Plains Apaches or Kiowa Apaches, who had long, long ago allied with the Kiowas. And so they're way over there, but still speaking their native language and practicing their culture. You've got the Jicarilla in green up there in the north, and then the groups along the border in West Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, the Mexican border. The groups that we've been talking about in this context, which is the Mescalero, and then the Chiricahua there in pink, and the Western Apaches, which is made up of several groups that are the westernmost of these groups, mostly in Arizona, a little bit into New Mexico. In fact, let's zoom in on Arizona to get a closer look at those Western Apaches and the different groups that comprise the Western Apache. This is actually a map of modern day contemporary reservations in Arizona, which kind of match up in some cases, in most cases, with the traditional territories. We'll look at another map that shows the traditional territories in a moment, but this gives you an idea who we're talking about when we're talking about Western Apaches. You have a couple of groups there, the White Mountain Apaches and the San Carlos Apaches. They're in different shades of green right next to one another. San Carlos Reservation is enclosed in that dotted line yellow box. So those are two different dialects of Western Apache. Another Western Apache group is the group known as the Tonto Apache for centuries now. That's not what they call themselves. They call themselves Dilje'e, which might mean people with high-pitched voices. Of course, all Apaches refer to themselves more generally as Inde, the people. The neighbors of this group, the Dilje'e, including their Western Apache neighbors, called them names that translate into the wild people or the people that we can't understand. And that got translated into Spanish by the Spanish as tonto, which is Spanish for foolish or dumb person or clown. Not surprisingly, the Dilje'e prefer not to be called by that appellation because it's insulting, but it is how they've been known in history books. In fact, things get a little confusing when you go west of the Western Apaches and you look at some of the other groups that speak a human dialect, including way down there in the lower left corner, the Yuma people, or the Quetzan, which is how they think of themselves and how they refer to themselves. It's their autonym. You also have the Tohono O'odham nation. They're kind of in this dark blue purple color there at the bottom, known for a long time as Papago, which they have decided to quit answering to because it is also an insulting term from their neighbors translated into Spanish. That means bean eaters. And then you've got there to the north several different modern day reservations holding the Yavapai people. Now, the Yavapai were not Apache. They were people who spoke one of those human dialects related to those other two tribes, but they were closely allied with some of the Western Apache tribes, including the Dilje'e, and also lived really close to them. And so when settlers came into the area, they assumed that the Yavapai were Apaches, which, not speaking any of these indigenous languages, they didn't see the distinction between Athabascan language groups and human language groups. Anyway, they call them Yavapai Apaches or sometimes Mojave Apaches, which the Yavapai people are neither Apache nor Mojave. There is a Mojave tribe, and they also speak a human dialect. Anyway, if you look at the reservations, you'll see that today there's a reservation that is the Yavapai Apache community, and that's an area that is comprised of two different people living on the same reservation and essentially the same tribally federally recognized group, but they're two different distinct language and cultural groups. You've got Yavapais and you've got Western Apaches. So if you're coming to this new, it can be a little bit confusing. But we're going to be looking at, just briefly, at the Yavapai and their Western Apache allies and some things that happened there. Here we have another map showing the traditional territories of the different Apache groups in this region that we're talking about, along with where the reservations are today that they are associated with. So we talked a good bit, like I said, back in lecture number 40 about that war that's associated with Cochise in particular, and the fact that as that war wound down and Cochise was reaching an agreement with the U.S. Army, represented by Major General Oliver O. Howard, who was a former Civil War general where he had lost his arm, and also very much an abolitionist. And Howard University, the traditionally black university, is named after him. Anyway, In December 1872, they hammered out an agreement for a reservation for the Chiricahua people, and this was the area. You can see the boundary of what that reservation was supposed to be. And when Cochise passed away not too long after that, he was buried in that area, his people's home area, on what was then the Chiricahua Reservation. So Geronimo had left already and gone back to Mexico. And here we have a picture of some of the other individuals that were associated with Cochise's wars that did not allow themselves to be confined to reservations. Nana and Hu and Victorio, all of whom, well, Victorio in particular, we'll be talking about a good bit in a few minutes. The other two we've talked about before, and we'll be mentioning them briefly again. And here is a map that we looked at before back in lecture number 40. By the way, if you're not one of my students and you haven't been following these along, perhaps you're getting the hint that I'm saying if you haven't already, you should watch lecture 40 to get the context for what we're talking about. Anyhow, you can see here several of the places and things that we've talked about in that lecture number 40, including the location where Geronimo lost his first family in a raid by Mexican soldiers. You can also see there the area where Cochise was buried after he died of cancer in 1874, secretly buried by some of his closest supporters so that his body's location would not be known to Anglos, to white folks who might feel inclined to dig it up and take souvenirs from it. You can also see up there in the upper right, Fort Sumner, which was right there next to the Bosque Redondo, which was the reservation that the Navajos and Mescalero Apaches were confined to for a while until that reservation was shut down and the Navajos were allowed to go back to their homeland there in the northern area on the border of New Mexico and Arizona. And the Mescaleros were removed down to this agency right next to Fort Stanton. Fort Stanton, we've mentioned a couple of times. It was one of the stops on the Goodnight Loving Cattle Trail. The Mescaleros were later in the early 1870s removed again a little farther south to the reservation where they still are. And if you recall just the previous video before this one, when we talked about outlaws and we talked about Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War, that's right in between Fort Stanton and the Mescalero reservation, which was a good site for raising cattle because you could sell them to the U.S. Army for the forts and for the Indian for the Indian agency there. And you can also see the location here of the San Carlos agency. Also talked about that in the video before this one about outlaws because we talked about the Apache Kid. And we'll be talking about San Carlos a good bit here in a moment. So, spoiler alert, if you read this map closely, you will be, seeing the locations of stuff that we haven't talked about yet, but are about to get to. But first, let's talk briefly about the Yavapai again. There was a war between the United States government and the Yavapai and their some of their Western Apache allies that started in 1871. And really the fighting lasted till 1873. Final resolution came in 1875. So this is called the video again, the last Apache Wars. These folks aren't Apaches, but all the white people fighting them thought they were, and that's what they called them. And they also were fighting alongside, in some cases, the and other Western Apache people. Well, let's take a look at how this whole thing started, shall we? This is Camp Grant, which in a moment we'll get a closer look at the map. But Camp Grant was a military camp, and several of the Western Apache people started kind of coming in here to this area looking for food, basically. And the junior officer who was in charge allowed them in and gave them some food, and then more came in, and the people of Arizona, that is to say, the white people, the settlers of Arizona, were really kind of upset about the fact that in order to resolve things with the local tribes, that the U.S. government, and by the way, Arizona is not a state yet, it's a territory, so it's administered by the federal government, was actually establishing these Indian agencies and giving food to the Indians, all of whom the local people just lumped in together as Apaches instead of killing them off, you know. So some of the local folks, local white folks, together with some Tohono O'odham warriors, came to Camp Grant and attacked these Western Apaches. There may have been some Yavapais among them, but definitely Western Apaches, in what's come to be known as the Camp Grant Massacre. They swept in and they just killed everybody, basically. 144 people, men, women, and children, and all their dogs. And they had a lot of dogs. They killed all the dogs too. 29 children were not killed because they were taken by the Tohono O'odham back south and traded in Mexico as slaves. Later, when the U.S. military forces were able to come in and not really able to do anything about it when it was happening, but when they came in and looked for survivors, they found one survivor, I think, one woman. And this was considered, obviously, an outrage by the federal government. President Grant was extraordinarily unhappy about it, and he demanded that something be done, or else he was going to declare martial law in Arizona territory. So some of the people who had participated, and by the way, the way that the massacre had worked is that the Tohono O'odham had come in and started killing people, and then their Anglo allies, I hesitate to call them Americans because everybody's American in this story, and also some of their Mexican-American allies, they kind of hung out at the perimeter and shot all the people who were trying to escape. So several of those folks were arrested and put on trial, but there was overwhelming public support for them, not for the victims, and they were acquitted. And shortly after that, a stagecoach was attacked, and almost everybody on it killed. The driver was killed. I think 5 passengers were killed. 2 passengers escaped, but one of them, a woman, died of her wounds. And this was blamed on the Yavapai because they were the closest ones. And maybe it was. I don't think we know for sure, but this was all the justification that was needed to come in and declare war now on the Yavapai, as well as the Western Apaches who were with them, standing with them. And this campaign was run by General George Crook, who you see right there on the right. We've talked about George Crook several times over the series of these various lectures. So, a couple of years of war. And at one point in Salt River Canyon, there were a group of Yavapai who had taken refuge in this cave. And the cave was discovered by the military forces and their Indian scouts, which I think in this case were mostly Pimas. and the U.S. Army attacked the Yapapais in this cave, and they shot into the cave, hoping that their bullets would ricochet around inside there and hit people, which they did. And they also, some of the soldiers, threw boulders down into the cave, crushing people. So, eventually, all the warriors in the cave were killed. There was no further resistance. Somewhere, the official U.S. Army number was 52, but it was probably more like 75 people killed. And it wasn't just warriors, because how could you differentiate when you're shooting blindly into a cave or throwing rocks into it? A lot of women and children were killed as well. And their bodies were just left there. They were just left there in that cave, which became known as Skeleton Cave, because decades later, 60, 70 years later, people were coming through, tourists could come in here and look at all the bones, all the skeletons of these Yavapai people who had been killed in what, now is justifiably described as a massacre. So 75 people killed on their side. On the other side, one Pima scout was killed. So the Yavapais surrendered at that point, and they were sent to Camp Verde, or Verde, and that's where they lived for the next couple of years. But then it was decided that they had to be removed to the San Carlos reservation. So they were forcibly moved, 1,500 of them, essentially through the desert, to San Carlos, and about 100 died along the way in what was described, or has been described, as the Exodus. The Exodus. In essence, it's yet another trail of tears. In this case, the Yavapai people's trail of tears. And again, if you look at history books about this, or accounts of it, you will often see them referred to as Apaches, although they themselves were not Apaches. Well, let's check in on Geronimo. He had been living south of the border in Mexico because it's a convenient place to fight Mexicans. So he was fighting Mexicans. However, when that Chiricahua Reservation was established in 1872, after that, Geronimo came up and stayed on that reservation. As you can see, it's pretty spacious. It's a really large area. So he was content with coming up there and staying among his people, and then sortying out southward across the border into Mexico and fighting Mexicans, when he felt like it. And that was working out all right for him. But then the United States government also had that thought, not to fight Mexicans, they'd already had that thought, but the thought that, that's a pretty big region for the Chiricahuas. Let's take them off of that. That's way too much. And put them at the San Carlos Agency, which is where they already had the San Carlos Western Apache, and then the White Mountain Apache were just north of there. So the Chiricahuas were told, no, you can't have this area. That's your home territory. We're going to remove you to the San Carlos Agency. So they were taken up there, Geronimo included. And Geronimo discovered that he didn't like all the rules. He didn't like being controlled. Also, it was not nearly as handy and convenient to the Mexican border as the other place. So he left with a group of followers. And U.S. Army troops followed and captured him and brought him back, and explained, this is where you're staying from now on. So he did stay there for a while. Now, meanwhile, well, not meanwhile, a little bit later, actually, that was in 1877 when Geronimo left. It was 1875 when the Chiricahuas were removed up to San Carlos. It was a couple of years later, in 77, when Geronimo made his temporary vacation away and was brought back. In 1879, over in New Mexico, The Warm Springs Apaches, who were another branch of the Chiricahua, they lived on the Ojo Caliente reservation, which is Spanish for warm springs. It was right there in their home territory. But by this point, the government, the U.S. government, had decided that they're going to do the best they could to cram all the Apaches onto that San Carlos agency. So the Warm Springs Chiricahuas were informed, you're leaving your home and going to San Carlos. Now, San Carlos was even further away from the home territory of the Warm Springs Apaches than the than it was for the other Chiricahuas. So one of the principal leaders of the Warm Springs Apaches, named Victorio, who had fought alongside Geronimo and Cochise during that previous war, he announced, I don't know that he necessarily announced, he just didn't show up. He took a group and remained there initially around his home area, and then eventually southward to Mexico. About 80 warriors and their families, so 200 or 300 people total. And he was soon joined by other Warm Springs Apaches, led by the elderly leader Nana, who came down and joined him in Mexico. He was also joined, Victorio that is, by his own younger sister, Lozen. Now, Victorio was probably around his mid-50s. Lozen was in her late 30s. She came and joined up with her brother, and he placed an enormous amount of confidence in her. She was a warrior woman. She was reported to have had an uncanny connection with the spirit world and with Usen, the most powerful of the Apache deities, essentially the Great Spirit, and that she was able to foretell the location of enemies and when they were getting close. He introduced her to Nana as his sister, who was a strong woman, stronger than any man, braver than most men, and a mighty shield to her people. And indeed she was. She was very capable, a very capable lieutenant to her older brother, Victorio. So they're all down there in Mexico. And at a certain point in 1880, about a year after they had headed southward, by the way, for that whole year, they had been engaged in warfare along the border with both the U.S. Army and the Mexican Army. Well, about a year into that, one of the young women of the band gave birth. So she had an infant child, and Lozen decided that it was not it was a dangerous lifestyle for an infant, going around being chased by two armies. So she volunteered to take this young mother and her child to safety to the Mescalero reservation, because at this point going back to Ojo Caliente would not be safe. So kind of an odyssey across the desert. She took this young mother, stole a couple of horses for them, and kind of fearful of alerting soldiers by gunfire, she did all of her hunting with only a knife and fed them and got them there to that reservation. Now, while she was gone, Nana led a small group out on a scouting expedition, and the main force under Victorio was there near on the place on the map that's called Cerro Tres Castillos, which means three castle mountain, or three castles, mountain of three castles. It was a desert plain with a little oasis, and close by three huge rock formations. That's the three castles, the Tres Castillos. Victorio was unable to cross the New Mexico border to get to the Mescalero people who were his allies, because General Benjamin Grierson, in command of the 10th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers, had essentially set up defensive positions to prevent him from getting back in. The U.S. Army and the Mexican Army were actually cooperating and working together on this mission, this war. And so, unable to cross the border, he decided that, they're going to be looking for me in the mountains because that's where we like to hang out. So let's go onto this desert plain and they won't be looking for us there. But he was wrong. And so while his sister was gone and while Nana and his group were also gone, Victorio was attacked by the Mexican army in October 1880, and he was killed. So Lozen heard about her brother's fate, and she left the Mescalero reservation and made her way back down into Mexico to join up with her own people, the Ojo Caliente, Warm Springs, Chiricahua Apaches, now being led by Nana. Around this same time, up at the San Carlos Agency, Geronimo was getting a little bit nervous. You see, there had been some fighting between the U.S. Army and the White Mountain Apaches, some fighting near Fort Apache. And in fact, some of the Army's Apache scouts, who were White Mountain Apaches, had mutinied, rebelled. And that was put down, but the rumor was that the government was going to crack down now on all the charismatic indigenous leaders at the agency who might be problematic. And Geronimo had heard that they planned to have him arrested and put in prison. So he and some followers decided to not wait around and see if that was true. They left. They left and went southward and joined up with Nana and Lozen also. In fact, Geronimo sort of replaced Victorio so far as the relationship with Lozen as an older brother, because from this point forward, she was going to be his lieutenant and his mighty shield for the people, and did all the same services that she had done for her own brother with Geronimo. Now, around this time also, another Chiricahua leader that we have met before, who made a raid on the San Carlos Agency, and some of the Apaches there took advantage of that opportunity to leave with him when he withdrew. And so they went down south of the border and sort of rendezvoused with this other group, which is now getting larger and continuing to fight against the Mexican army. On the northern side of the border, General George Crook was brought in to get a handle on this situation. So he comes in and he decides to taking Tom Horn along as scout and interpreter to track down these errant Apaches, errant, of course, in his opinion. And again, the U.S. government is working closely with the Mexican government. And Crook and his forces actually managed to sort of sneak up on Geronimo's group and get the drop on them, which Geronimo found impressive. He respected that. And so he agreed to come back to the San Carlos Agency. And Nana and Lozen as well went with him. Who did not? He stayed in Mexico. And not long after that, actually died while crossing a river on horseback. He may have had a heart attack. So anyhow, the others, however, returned to the San Carlos Agency, and by now it's 1883. So 2 years after having left the agency, Geronimo and these others are back there, but it's not going to last for very long. In fact, a small correction, Geronimo agreed to come back to San Carlos in 1883, but it was February of 84 before he actually got there. And he stayed a little over a year. In May of the following year, he and several followers left yet again, and this time, as they were operating along the border, even though there were only a few dozen of these Chiricahuas now with Geronimo, they may have killed as many as 300 or 400 people along the border on both sides of the border, and that's because they would raid small farms and just kill everyone who was there, essentially. Once again, the U.S. and Mexican governments cooperate, and General Crook goes after him again, trying to catch him, having a really hard time doing so. Took a couple of years to finally reach the point where Geronimo and his ever diminishing band were in a position that they were willing to consider surrendering and coming back. Geronimo was a little bit discouraged by the fact that by now the U.S. Army was using Chiricahua Apaches as Apache scouts. So some of his own people were helping to hunt him down. And so that was both A, discouraging, and B, they knew all the places that he might be. And it was getting ever more difficult for his small group to get access to food. So in March of 1886, he agreed to come in and meet with General Crook to discuss terms of surrender. Well, as it turns out, at this meeting, General Crook had allowed a photographer, and not just any photographer, C.S. Fly, the photographer from Tombstone, Arizona, that took that famous photo of Ike Clanton that we've looked at a couple of times. And I guess Clanton must have been attached to it because he escaped from the gunfight at the OK Corral running through Fly's photo studio. Anyway, same guy, kind of a connection. And he was there on hand to take several photographs of Geronimo and his band coming in, at least the Warriors, well, not just the Warriors, I guess the whole band, coming in to negotiate and discuss things with General Crook. So this includes the famous photo that we looked at the very beginning of this lecture, and it also includes a photograph that you can see right here of Geronimo and his men meeting with General Crook's staff. This is significant in that this was the very first time ever that a photograph was taken of an indigenous leader while that indigenous leader was still at war with the United States. It was also the first time ever that any photographs had been taken of Apaches, or I believe any indigenous military war group in the field. So they came in, and over the course of the discussions, Geronimo was talking with one of the soldiers who let slip, and this may have been true and it may not have been, but the soldier told him that, yeah, as soon as we get you back across the border, because this was in Mexico, you are to be killed. And so they're having these discussions. They took a break for the evening, and several soldiers obviously are supposed to keep an eye on their Apache guests, but those Apache guests just melt away into the desert. They just disappeared on them and left, leaving General Crook with egg on his face, because this was supposed to be his big victorious moment when he gets this treaty with Geronimo, who, by the way, over the previous couple of years with all the raids that this small group had made, Geronimo had become very famous. The most famous. He was more famous at this point than even Sitting Bull, probably, and certainly more feared because Sitting Bull was at this time, in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. The result of this is that General Crook was recalled. He was taken off the case, if you will. I mean, he wasn't fired. He was still a general, and in fact, he got promoted after this. But the pursuit of Geronimo passed over to General Nelson Miles, whom we have also met on several occasions. Miles had a pretty significant ace up his sleeve. He had a young officer under his command named Charles Gatewood, who spoke some Apache and who also not only knew a little bit, a reasonable bit, about Apache culture, but appreciated it and admired it, and so knew how to comport himself with Apaches. And he had won the respect of Geronimo, and so that was one of the reasons that Geronimo was willing to come in and have meetings again with this new commander, Miles. And a surrender was made just a few months after he had slipped away from General Crook. General Miles decided that these Apaches, now that they were safely surrendered, were not going to go back to the San Carlos agency at all. They were going to prison as far from San Carlos as he could get them. He sent them to a federal prison in Florida. And so here you can see this is over half of Geronimo's band. By the time of the surrender, Geronimo had with him 38 people total, including 16 warriors, counting himself. So here they are waiting to be put on the train to be sent to prison in Florida. Some of them were sent to a prison in Alabama. So here's Geronimo, and there just behind him, just over his shoulder, is Lozin, who also is sent. She's sent to a prison in Alabama where she caught tuberculosis and died. In fact, about a quarter of the Apaches who were sent died within a short time of disease. And it was more than just the ones that were in Geronimo's band. There were several others who had resisted that were also charged. And in an unexpected turn of events for some people, but maybe not for others, the Apache Scouts, who had helped the U.S. government, the U.S. Army, to track down Geronimo, were also sent to the Florida prison, which was just absolutely anathema to General Crook, who had previously commanded these Apache Scouts. He was furious and outraged, but he was no longer in charge here, and Miles was. Now, later on, well, let me just say this, that General Crook had a nickname from the Apaches. They called him the Gray Wolf. The Lakota people up in the northern plains that he had also fought against, if you'll remember, he was part of that whole campaign in the Great Sioux War in 1876. They had a more practical name for him, 3 Stars, because that's what was on his uniform before he got that promotion. Anyhow, Red Cloud, remember him? The Lakota leader. He said of General Crook, in his old age, and both of their old ages, I guess, that speaking about General Crook, at least he never lied to us. And I bet that those Apaches felt the same way in having the dealings that they had with General Miles after General Crook was out of the picture. If you'll remember also, General Crook is the one who, even though he was in charge and arrested Standing Bear in Nebraska, he actually had encouraged Standing Bear to sue the Army and sue him specifically, which led to that landmark Supreme Court case. They were there in Florida for a few years, and then because the death rate was so high among them, they were finally allowed to go and rejoin their people, but not at San Carlos. And they weren't really rejoining their people. They were sent to be prisoners of war at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where at least they were around other indigenous people, and that's where Geronimo spent the rest of his life there as a prisoner of war at Fort Sill. And like I said before, he had become very famous. He became a celebrity, just like Quanah Parker and Sitting Bull. And over 20 years after this war ended, a little over 22 years, Geronimo, who was in his 50s, maybe pushing 60 back at this time when he was leading this war, finally passed away near Fort Sill, Oklahoma, when on a bitterly cold night he was thrown from his horse and was unable to get up and walk away from that. He was by himself, and he finally was found, and by that time he was very sick and he had pneumonia. Died of pneumonia in 1908 as a prisoner of war at Fort Sill, where he is buried, as is Quanah Parker, the great Comanche leader. Their graves are like a stone's throw apart. And it has been reported that when he was on his deathbed, being attended by his nephew, that Geronimo's last words were, "I should never have surrendered. I should have kept fighting till I was the last man alive." Geronimo and his little band, up to his surrender in 1886, were the last free indigenous people in North America. So with the defeat of Geronimo at that point, everybody is, well, either in prison like him or on a reservation. So these are the reservations as of 1890. Although I immediately spotted an error on this map. They've got the Chiricahua Apache on this reservation down there in Arizona Territory. That is not their reservation. They didn't have a reservation anymore. They had previously had a reservation up until 1875. South of that reservation where they have them placed here, the spot where they have them placed is actually the White Mountain and San Carlos reservations. But, you still get the idea. All of the indigenous nations of North America, of the United States, and really of North America. Well, Canada's doing things a little bit differently, not very differently though. Let's say the U.S. They're on reservations, right? And so you know that in that year of 1890, that's when the massacre at Wounded Knee took place up in the Great Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, which was framed by the government at the time as a major Indian battle in the Indian Wars, and a bunch of soldiers got medals and stuff. We know it was actually a massacre. Here you can see large numbers of people, men, women, and children who were killed, being shoved into a big common grave. That was the last battle of the Indian Wars, though it wasn't really a battle. So as of 1890, no more tribal groups resisting. Now there may be some individuals. Also, by 1890, as we have discussed, the Dawes Act, which had been passed in 1887, had already started being implemented. and tribes, not just in Oklahoma, but around the country, were starting to lose even more of their lands from their reservations that were opened up and made public lands. So that the situation developed. This map we've seen a couple of times. Here is 1820 to 1839. All the non-white areas on this map in 1820 were controlled by the indigenous people of those areas. All the ones that are not dark brown had been lost to them by 1839. And then here by by the 1870s, 80s, 90s, up to the present is what the situation is. Just little patches, tiny little patches here and there, which effectively removed the native people as obstacles to quote unquote progress and to westward expansion of the United States, which is the name of this lecture series, mainly because it's the name of the class that this lecture series is attached to, which is why I did not approach this course as being a course about the history of the West, specifically like across the Mississippi, but rather of a process. And that situation that had developed with the indigenous people being removed as obstacles to westward expansion leads us right into this very picture that we started the course with on day one, may have been slide one, back in that very first lecture. Frederick Jackson Turner and his famous frontier thesis delivered at a history conference in 1893, in which he declared the end of the frontier, which was achieved, of course, in part by the destruction of the sovereignty of the indigenous people of this continent. As I've been progressing along in this lecture series, I've had a lot of people viewing these that are not in my classes, that just found them on YouTube, and I appreciate that. I'm glad that they are. And I've gotten some great and interesting comments from people, and some not so great and interesting. Some people come on to argue about me being a historical revisionist that's just papering over everything and trying to make it out like the native people were horribly mistreated and cheated, and that it wasn't fair. If I've come across that way, well, like Will Rogers used to say, I don't make the news. I just read it and report on it. So we still got a little bit left to go. One more, well, actually, we've got two more lectures. The next one is going to wrap up and put a cap on the 19th century and into the early 20th century, not of the history of the American West, because that's not what this is, but of westward expansion and what that means and what it turned into from this point. And then the final one is going to be just a look at the West and the frontier in the popular culture of the 20th and 21st centuries. So come back and be here for the last couple of lectures.